like the reforms are only helping the rich get richer. At least that's exactly what our data is telling you in that introduction. That, according to, is a study that came in from Income Disparities in India, co-authored by renowned French economist Thomas Piketty. The study makes a startling revelation that the income disparity is at the highest level since 1922, when income tax was introduced in India. In fact, the top 1% of the country's rich income earners actually capture almost 1/4 of the total income pie in this country. What's also significant is the fact that the richest 1% of the population controls 60% of the country's wealth. The disparity is even wider when it comes to income growth.
To bridge the income disparity, socialism is clearly not the answer. Economic growth is. More government is not the answer. More governance is. Taxing the rich is not the answer. Widening the tax net is. Time for some tough questions tonight on the India development debate.
Indeed, we will begin with Nayantara Rai, who's joining in with all the details right here. 8 lakh people controlling 60% of the total wealth in this country. That's quite a telling statistic there, Nayantara.
That's right, a fascinating study by Thomas Piketty as well as Lucas Chancel. The best way to describe it is British Raj to the billionaire Raj. So if you go to the key findings of the study, they say that inequality in the country is today at its highest level since the Income Tax Act came into effect in 1922. So stark and so large is the gap that 1% of your population is actually contributing 22% of the income. The study backtracks and discovers that in 1930s, the top 1% earners captured 21% of the total income. In 1980s, the top 1% earners captured 6% of the total income. And when the growth rate was actually the slowest in the 1970s to the 1980s is when the inequality and the gap was at its lowest. That is when you saw the least, when you talk about the inequality. So another way to look at it is that should you have low growth rates, because that will lead to more inclusiveness and would lead to less inequality? Absolutely not. We at ET Now are being contrarian and saying that is unacceptable for a country like India. We need high growth rates, but we also need inclusive growth. We cannot have jobless growth, for example. Jobs is, of course, a key rhetoric that you hear about today. We need job creation. We need government policies that will be inclusive in nature, game changers. For example, the goods and services tax. Yes, there are teething problems, but once the goods and services tax is in existence for a longer time, you will, of course, see the tax base getting widened. A large part of your informal economy is going to be formalized. And that is what we're going to discuss today on India Development Debate with Supriya, Shrinate and Sandeep Gurumurthi at 9 p.m. How India cannot be satisfied with a low growth rate because it's going to lead to less inequality. Absolutely not. We want high growth rates with good government policies which are inclusive in nature.
All right, thanks very much for that, Nayantara Rai. And we're going to take it across to a stellar panel that's going to discuss the inequalities that exist in India. Why has the poor not benefited from economic reforms, and what is the way out? It clearly cannot be back to the old rhetoric of socialism. We've got Maitri Basnoor, our consulting editor, joining us right here. Mahesh Vyas, MD and CEO of the CMIE. Priyanka Chaturvedi represents the Congress Party. Arvind Gupta of the BJP. And R. Jagannathan, editorial director, Swaraj Magazine, along with Sunit Chopra of the CPIM. Thanks each one of you for being with us. I think because you represent the Treasury benches here and this data is rather startling, Arvind Gupta, why have benefits of economic growth not reached India's poor? I mean, look at what the data is telling you. 1% is occupying nearly 1/4 of the entire national income. Arvind Gupta, did you get my question there? Why have benefits of economic growth and reforms not reached India's poor in all these years?
Yeah, so Supriya, based on what the report has published, we can either get into the specifics of the report, but in general, the overall theme, I did. See, I think there are many ways to answer that. The way I would like to begin this debate is that India needs to look at a plan and a vision where the bottom of the pyramid is not looked at, somebody that you could just give entitlements to, and really not include them in income growth, and just treat them as somebody that you have to take care of. You have to empower them and treat them as somebody who will take care of themselves in the future. So it was, I think, fundamental in my view is the whole thing of entitlement versus empowerment. Going forward, we have to empower people to become more self-employed, become more skilled, and really become a job creator, and add to the value. I think the numbers that you have presented, I have seen the report. They give a lot of information, but also they do an unfair job of for example, saying when the least inequality happened when in the mid 70s and 80s, and your opening statement said about the low growth rate. So I think that's not the path that India needs to take. India needs to take a path of inclusive growth, high growth rate, and something that is with a lot of jobs being created. So I think that's my statement.
Right.
The way I look at it is the future of India is where everybody in India has right skills, is empowered to get the right job. The agriculture sector, where we have a vision of doubling the income, is also part of that growth story of India. And
okay.
I think that's a very, very important part.
Fair.
And we have to take everybody along in that.
Okay, I don't want to make this a political debate, but I do want to get reactions from all three political parties before I toss it to some of the finest economists and commentators joining us on the show this evening. Priyanka Chaturvedi, I'm going to come to you. Who does one blame for India's income inequality? I mean, I don't want to make it a BJP, Congress, and we will talk about entitlement-based policies later in the debate, but who does one blame for such a high level of inequality that exists even today in India, as per this study by Thomas Piketty?
So when I read that study and I read an earlier report on income inequalities, we must understand till 80s, we saw something that was at 6%, the inequality at 6% has risen up to 22% as per the report that you are talking about. But you also need to understand this entire inequality debate started, I think, post the when we started liberating our markets and opening our markets to businesses, etc. That's when inequality started staring us in the face. And while policies, of course, need to be questioned and how efforts were made to bridge that gap, but when we start questioning the entitlement policy, I think that would be a lot unfair, because that is the only way. When you try to increase your social welfare spend, you reduce inequality, and that is what our government attempted in the past decade. And if you would also see, when we got people out of the poverty, above the poverty limit that they were living in, and brought them into middle income groups, I think that was the highest rise which even the United Nations acknowledged. So there are two things that come into it. When you have an income inequality as high as that, you make policies which are more inclusive. You do not see that happening in this government right now. Since 2014, we have seen a policy push which is more towards creating more inequalities. When we talk about increasing social welfare spend, that has seen a reduction. So these are questions, and that is why you see a GDP growth rate slowing. You see rising unemployment. You see economic policies which are not addressing the concerns of the poor, and how you ensure that we have an equitable development, which is not happening. So these are questions that need to be asked of the government. I did not want to make this political, but since questions are being asked about policies which were started during our tenure, which try to empower people who were being left out of the entire growth story, trying to bring them on an equal platform, is something that we attempted to do, but unfortunately we don't see that happening, and a reverse trend happening, and that is why it shows in the numbers, where you see a rising trend from 1922 to 2017, you see it at its highest, the inequality at its highest, and a government which is not really looking at it.
Okay, I'm going to take this quickly and get a word in from Suneet Chopra before I move any forward. And Suneet, has economic reforms benefited only the rich in India?
There's no doubt about that. The more dangerous thing is that we have policies that don't care as to what happens to the ordinary Indian citizen. You have 1,000 children nearly in UP dying in the hospitals for lack of oxygen cylinders. You have over 3 lakh farmers who have committed suicide and nobody seems to be bothered. You have enormous unemployment on the one hand and a rising crime rate on the other. Nobody is bothered. And the strange thing is that your taxation system is inclusive because 94% of your taxation is indirect taxes which are paid for by the people. We may say that a few people pay the income tax, but the reality is that an enormous amount of taxation goes through indirect taxation. So you have a situation where you don't care about the people of your country. You don't care what's happening. And you can get a situation then, which we have got, where people are going to gangsters as killers. You have just seen the murder of this journalist. And I won't be surprised. They said this was a kind of hired killer. Every now and then you get in the newspapers, hired killers.
Right.
In fact, you're making more money killing people for gangsters than you are with hard work. And I think this is disgraceful for any country.
Okay. We get your opening comments there, Sunit Chopra. We want to give all three of you a chance to present your point of view. And you know, we want to steer this debate in a very different direction because, you know, while we are debating this report, I have a fundamental issue with some of the sort of findings of this report and some of the analysis that it throws up. And we'll come to that in just a bit. But let me go to R. Jagannathan, and I reckon he'd probably agree with our view on this. Jaggi, first up, is inclusive growth just an academic debate in this country? You know, we've heard that Congress talk about it for 10 years. Even the government now, talks about inclusive growth, sabka saath, sabka vikas is a different. Is it just sort of an academic debate? Is it something that we've just not been able to, address it in a holistic manner, and that there is a complete lack of political will when it comes to inclusive growth?
I think everybody has talked, or at least begun to talk about inclusive growth. I think it probably started sometime in about 10 or 15 years ago, when Vajpayee talked about then the UPA gathered steam, and now Modi is talking the same thing. And I think it is beginning to happen. It was not really happening earlier because the benefits of growth, the explosive growth that began after liberalization in 1991, invariably tended to help the better off sections because they are the ones who are more likely to benefit from the growth. So it was logical that people who are in the best position to capture the benefits of growth got it. It is now, once you have created a certain amount of income streams and wealth, that you can see how you can redirect it so that it also benefits the poor. And let's also not forget, the state in India spent a lot of money trying to remove poverty. We had Garibi Hatao as a slogan in 1969, and we are still talking about it. Okay, the reason why it didn't happen was, if Rajiv Gandhi says 85% of the rupee that I am spending on the poor is not going to the poor, how will you become equality? You will have inequality, because we had crony socialism where in the name of the poor a lot of money is spent, but the money actually went to crooks and politicians and their business cronies. So that part of it is what is getting fixed slowly as you go to direct benefits transfers and as you go to Aadhaar based identification of fake beneficiaries. So inclusive growth is now probably happening in a real sense because the money that is being spent by the government is going to the intended beneficiaries. It started under the UPA, now it is gathering steam under this thing. So I think we have to take several of these issues together. I think in crony socialism, there was no way you could have had in growth going to across all people. It actually went only to a few people. You had a license permit Raj. How do you expect the poor to benefit when you have a license permit Raj? You are basically giving people a license to print money. That was what the socialism was all about. So the minute you created a socialistic system which benefited one, you're going to have that inequality.
Right.
Actually, I'm going to question the very premise of the socialistic system a little later in the show when we discuss inequality versus poverty. But Mahesh Vyas, I'm going to throw this to you. We at best compare things with China, and if you look at the statistics there, the bottom 50% in India during that period grew 3 times more slowly than their Chinese counterparts. The middle 40% grew 6 times more slowly than how they grew in China. But the top percentile, absolutely the top, 0.001%, grew at a lot faster rate than they did in China. Is the problem then unique to India?
Well, I think the debate so far has gone around trying to interpret the results as you are spewing out all these numbers, and there are lots of them. I think what I'd like to focus on is that in India, we haven't quite focused on inequality. We talk of inclusive growth, and comparison to China is completely out of place because we have followed two completely different paths, and we have a completely different mechanism of enabling growth. So we are a democracy, we have hurdles on the way to growth, and I don't think it is a debate over here whether we should emulate the Chinese system or not. But it is instructive that the two of us have grown, the two countries have grown very differently. I'm not surprised by that, particularly on income distribution. What is important is that Thomas Piketty and company have brought focus into estimating inequality. That I find remarkable. Note, the paper put out by them uses different sources of data, multiple sources of data in the face of not having clear data. And thanks to them, the government actually released data on taxation, on tax assessees for the last 3 years, which was not available, a gap of 10 years in data on tax assessees. We did that till 1999, and then we stopped even producing that data. So forget all this debate that we have on inclusiveness. Till there wasn't sufficient pressure from international researchers of great reputation, did the government of India restart releasing the data required to measure inequality in some sense. I think this is the most important takeaway from Piketty's and the work that they have put out. So I hope the government of India at least continues to put out this data to enable research, to enable informed debate on the level of inequality and the kind of inequality. Also associated with this is that we have almost stopped measuring poverty. So poverty and inequality go hand in hand, and I think there needs to be a greater focus on the measurement of these things on a regular basis so that we understand the dynamics of inequality. The problem is that our liberalization focused on industrial liberalization, trade liberalization, and price liberalization. But agriculture is left out of the loop, and that's where the inequality, in my opinion, essentially comes from. The use of tax data to estimate this is very, very complicated, and I would like to understand this in great detail. How do you deal with agriculture?
Right. It's an important point that you made on the fact that, in India, quality tax data is just not available. It took a decade, after which the government has now made it, has now started releasing some of that data, and clearly we need more transparency when it comes to this data. So to that extent, we definitely welcome this effort of Thomas Piketty, and I know he's been championing this for a while now. But Maithili, let me come to you then. Let's address the elephant in the room. And I'm sure this is going to spark a debate in the panel for sure, definitely between the political representatives. And I want to hear from you first. Do you fundamentally believe that entitlement-based policies that we've been pursuing for the last decade under the UPA rule, some of which are still being pursued under the NDA rule, have they failed India's poor? I know it's a provocative, sort of sweeping statement that I'm making here, but I want your view. Have they failed the country's poor? Maithili.
Sandeep, it's very difficult to give a categorical yes-no answer, but to the question whether reform has failed the poor, I think one must necessarily look at the data in a more nuanced fashion. So fact is that every single Indian, and I repeat, every single Indian is better post-reform than he was before reform. But have all classes benefited equally? Most certainly not. There are some categories of Indians who have benefited far more, some who have benefited far less. So the question really is, how do you ensure that the benefits are translated or filter down to all classes more or less equally? It can never be equal, because even in a communist society like China, in fact with Thomas Piketty's numbers could be disputed by many others, because if you look at World Bank numbers, IMF numbers, they show the Gini coefficient, which is a measure, this is a measure that economists use to measure income inequality. The Gini coefficient is higher in China than in India. So even though Thomas Piketty's numbers suggest something slightly different, there is no unanimity even amongst economists about what income inequality is, how do you measure it, and as Mahesh mentioned, the tax data in India that you have completely exclude agricultural income. So there are numerous inadequacies of the data. Having said that, yes, inequalities are certainly more than they were before the reform period, but certainly to the extent that it is, if you ask me, is it better that all of us are poor with not much difference in the level of poverty, or is it better that all of us are much better off, but some are perhaps much better off than before? I certainly think the second category is better, where everybody is better off. There is the effort of the state, and that is where state intervention comes in. What kind of state intervention? Do you give a man a fish a day, which is the entitlement approach, or do you teach him to fish? To my mind, it is always better to teach him to fish, because you cannot continuously distribute fish. There just aren't enough resources. So to my mind, certainly the entitlement approach of giving a man a fish a day is far inferior to teaching him how to fish. And that is what governments must try to do. Teach people how to fish, empower them.
Okay, Priyanka, I'm going to throw this to you, because we started this debate off by you objecting to the fact that we were panning the entitlement-based policies, and the assumption is that has it really failed India? I'm going to ask you a direct question. I know you and your party choose to call it empowerment, but still it is entitlement-based. How will you react to the point that Maithili is making? Teach the man how to fish. Don't give him fish on a platter, because it's going to fail someday or the other. You will run out of fish. You've just got him to teach how to fish himself.
So no, I take objection to, is that question for me?
Yes, that question is for you, Priyanka Chaturvedi. Okay,
so one thing I'd like to be very clear about, as far as entitlement and empowerment is concerned, I'm sorry, both sometimes complement each other too. So when we are trying to empower a whole lot of people who were not part of the growth story, or we saw a disparity, the income disparity that we are discussing here, there were ways and methods and means to address that issue. So if in some cases we were doing it through entitlement, and in some cases through empowerment, by creating job scenarios, by opening up markets, by opening up some segments, by investing in some segments, I do not think that all the policies were only about entitlement. It was also about creating a growth story for the country where people felt empowered, and that goes to show even in our numbers. So I find that a little unfair when our policies are only spoken about in the context of entitlement policies, because they are not entirely true. So when we empower, and it is quite funny when we talk about how Manrega numbers are increasing under Mr. Modi's government, and in from 2014 when we had the Prime Minister speak against it inside the Parliament, but we saw post demonetization how it helped out a lot of people when they were people who went jobless in the informal sector because of the demonetization, how Manrega helped many people in the rural areas. So what was called, accused us of calling entitlement became a tool of empowerment for them. So I think it works both ways. So policies are a mix of both, ensuring that this inequality is reduced, addressing these through our policies. But what we are seeing right now and post 2014, and I think even the report suggests that when it is at its highest, a government needs to intervene. When we talk about state intervention also has to see these inequalities and address these issues through policies, which we do not see coming from the government. We still see a government which is working towards a certain section of the people. So when we call them the suit boot ki sarkar, there's a reason why we are calling them so. When someone talks about agriculture, we do not discuss how land ordinance was brought in through, there was no discussion happening in the parliament, and ordinance was brought in and farmers were out there protesting.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Let me get in.
We need to discuss when we talk about inequality. We also need to talk about state intervention where policies are not being addressed to reduce this inequality.
Okay, fair enough. Let me get in Arvind Gupta. I was waiting for this to be brought up. I knew this is going to be brought up by the Congress. Arvind Gupta, the BJP may be preaching empowerment-based policies, may have criticized entitlement-based policies, but look what you're doing yourself with Manrega, like Priyanka Chaturvedi there just pointed out. How would you counter that point there? I mean, you are pursuing some of the policies that you panned while you were in the opposition, that, leading economists, people like Jaggi sitting in the panel, like Maithili, have criticized for years now, and they're same policies that you're pursuing today.
So, I started this with a very non-political debate, but I think Priyanka has made this into a very political issue. So, let me respond from a very political perspective. There are two things to be watched out over here. It's where the vision is. As Malika ji rightly pointed out, that it is, teaching a person how to fish rather than keep feeding them fish, and showing them a vision that even if today you are getting some benefits, some entitlements, the path to a secure future is to learn how to do that job yourself. So that is where the massive skilling and job creation will happen. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And that's the reverseness of the approach, that I think by slowly bringing down the entitlements and making people more empowered and pushing them into the job market, self-employment, whatever that may be. And a lot of schemes are directed towards that, whether that's the self-employment and talent utilization, the giving of credit to the small and medium businesses, the individual businesses, bringing out more digital and formal economy. So a lot of steps are actually focused on the lower part of the pyramid, getting better credit, lower interest rates, and things like that. So I think the whole approach is how do you invert that rather than just keep giving entitlement. That share of empowerment has to go a lot more so that entitlements keep reducing over time. The second approach is, Priyanka ji talks so much about the benefits and the Manrega, but according to all the numbers, and I will give due credit to the Aadhaar system that has been brought in by the Congress, is that finally there has to be a way to make sure whatever limited state benefits are there, they are getting utilized to its fullest. From it, today with this whole beautiful jam trinity, you have an available resource to make sure that the 100 rupees are getting utilized as 100 rupees. And that's a very important point that Jaggi also pointed out, and I want to emphasize on that. Because the state has limited resources, so instead of 15 rupees getting utilized, the 100 rupees get utilized. So you service a lot more people in the same amount of money. And you are empowering people to get the most out of the benefit. So it's a very progressive thing, and we need to
Arvind
take
Gupta,
that into
I get
account. The last point I do want to mention is
Arvind Gupta, I get you. Arvind Gupta, I'm going to come back to you. I've got your larger point. This is a retort to Priyanka Chaturvedi, but I think a lot of people out there will tell you that they expected Mr. Modi to be this free market thinker. He hasn't proven to be one. He's taken a more left of the ideology turn than we had expected him to. But I'm going to come back and discuss all of that in a while from now. Mr. Sunil Chopra, I know that you have a view that, this entire free market economics that one talks about takes a toll and all of that. But what has happened in states that have been ruled perennially by the left? What has happened in Bengal? Where is industrialization? Where is job creation? Where is prosperity? Is there equality in Bengal?
In fact, there are two aspects. One is industry and the other is agriculture. We have sufficient figures to show that with massive land reform that we moved to the moment we came to power, the people in the villages did considerably better. With regard to industry, much of this industry was politically not allowed to come to Bengal. There was a political blockage to prevent industry coming into Bengal. The third thing is that we should always look at. A lot of these industrialists borrow from the banks and never pay back their loans. And your non-performing assets have grown so enormously that you, in fact, have entitled the rich and have taken away entitlement from the poor. That is one aspect. The second
I'm sure
just
that
now,
can't be the
I have
reason
come
for no
back from
economic
North
activity,
Korea.
sir.
Let me tell you.
Mr. Chopra,
Sorry?
yes, all I'm saying is that, because
What did
NPAs
you
get
say?
created, NPA creation
Yes.
cannot be the answer to no economic activity taking place.
It's not a question of no economic activity. How do you measure economic activity? If I'm giving free medical aid, that doesn't come into the GDP. If I'm charging people for medicines, which they can't afford very often, they may have to take loans, they may even commit suicide, then you get a great GDP. So I think your whole system is geared to looting the masses, looting the country, and using the government not for governing or for governance, only helping those who do not contribute to the economy, or like some big industrialists, take loans of 10,000 crores and leave the country. So you must understand that this is a political choice. You are starving the people of India and you are feeding the rich who are corrupt.
Mr. Chopra, my problem is with this sort of, rich bashing or this capitalism bashing, and that's the problem where we are. I know this report, I'm going to come to you, Mahesh Vyas. This report seems to suggest that, the maximum equality in India happened between 1950 to 1960. I'll tell you what happened between 1950 to 1960. That's when, or between those 20 years, that's when we nationalized our banks, that's when we nationalized our railways, that's when we nationalized our airlines, that's when we moved the wealth from the private sector back into the public sector. That's when we had income tax rates in the 90%. I mean, that cannot be the way to get equality in the country, Mahesh Vyas.
Why not? Why not?
Mr. Sunil Chopra, I want to get Mahesh Vyas in, and then I'm going to open it up for you, but let me get a word from Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh Vyas, this is for you.
That people are getting
Sunil Chopra, I am going to interrupt you. This question was for Mahesh Vyas. Please let him answer. We'll come back to you. Mahesh Vyas, please go ahead.
They are getting free houses.
Mahesh Vyas, please go ahead. Mr. Chopra, I am going to interrupt you. This question was for Mr. Mahesh Vyas. Please, no one interrupted when you spoke. Please let him speak. Yes, Mahesh Vyas.
So I think liberalization that we began from 91-92 did help increase the growth rate in the country, and simultaneously it did increase inequality. But mind you, around that time, all sections of the economy did rise. Poverty did decline. That means, although inequality did increase, we did see incomes rise substantially across the board. So all groups did benefit from liberalization, and I think what is important is to continue on this task of letting markets play a bigger role in allocating resources, in spurring investments and enabling growth through jobs. So I think there is no question that liberalization and market forces in general do help. So if we pursue the policy of greater market forces playing their role, greater liberalization, greater opening up to competition from overseas, I think we will see better income growth. Just see the difference that has happened from 91-92. Measurement has been stopped, but we can see prosperity across the board. We can see people better fed, better clothed, and living a better life in general. What has happened is inequality has increased because liberalization has been partial. Like I mentioned earlier, the agricultural sector has not benefited entirely from liberalization. If we can move that liberalization, the reforms process a little more aggressively, and most importantly, reforms through enabling, ensuring that the markets do play a bigger role in our lives and not the government.
All right, we all wish government played a lesser role, and which is why we like the phrase maximum governance, minimum government, but that hasn't really happened. No, but Sunil Chopra, I'm going to get a reaction from R. Jagannathan on something that you said. And Jackie, I was very surprised when Mr. Sunil Chopra said, why not, to a question that Sandeep was raising, that we can't go back to putting private money to public spaces just like we did when we nationalized a whole host of things. Are you equally surprised as well that in 2017 we're actually debating, should we go back to the whole mode and script of nationalization?
Look, I think the world is moving towards a convergent idea where markets work, you should not screw around with it, you should let it function. But where markets do not work, there I think you need to have the state or someone enabled by the state to come in. So like for example, currently I don't think the infrastructure space is going to allow private sector to do when land per hectare is going to cost you 2 crore. There is no highway that is going to be profitable in decades. Okay, so the government will have to buy the land and probably let it do things. Maybe the private sector can help in operating it and probably collecting the revenues or whatever it is. So in a sense, it's not a private sector versus public sector argument. We can't say that it's a socialist or a capitalist argument. The point is, where the markets can work, it should be allowed to work. What the UPA actually did was destroyed 3 markets at least. One is they destroyed the market for food by creating 3 different prices for food. The one is the genuine market price, then you have a ration market price, then you have the Food Security Act market price. Then you destroyed the land market by saying that whoever land is acquired is going to be paid 4 times the market value. Instead of creating first a market value, you actually created an artificial price, which again destroys the market. Instead of restoring the right to property, you've done something else. Same thing you did to the Right to Education Act. You now pushed up fees because you said 25% of the guys have to be given free thing. Okay, fine. So what has happened? The net result is thousands of schools have closed down, fees have gone up, government subsidies for the remaining 25% have gone up, and you actually distorted the education market. So you are distorting market after market and you expect things to work. I mean, so what I'm trying to say is that it is not a market or non-market controversy, but that where markets work, don't mess around with it. Where they don't work, yes, the state needs to step in. That is as simple as that.
I'm sure Priyanka Chaturvedi will want to comment, but Maithili, I want to bring you in here because, you know, we've still not answered Suneet Chopra in a convincing manner, because my sense is what's going to come next from him is we should tax the rich more. Why is the highest tax bracket only 30%? It should be, we should go back to the days of Indira Gandhi or at least Rajiv Gandhi when we were taxing at 65%. Maybe that's what we should do. Forget about widening the tax net. Forget about ensuring that every citizen of this country who's evading this tax should be, you know, should be put behind bars and made to pay a price. Forget about all that. But let's, you know, go after the few people in this country who are paying tax. Let's tax the rich. Let's tax the upper middle class. That's what we're going to hear next. Maithili?
Well, absolutely. I'm not against taxing the rich, but certainly not going back to the time of Mrs. Indira Gandhi when the marginal tax rate was 97.5, because what we have seen is that the fastest reduction in poverty, and I repeat, the fastest reduction in poverty happened when tax rates swelled, when the economy was opened up to market forces. And as Jaggi said, it's not a question of socialism or capitalism, but wherever the market functions and functions efficiently, of course, albeit with efficient regulators, let the market function. Wherever there are certain areas where the market does not function, particularly in the area of primary healthcare, primary education, roads, bridges, these are particularly in rural areas. These are areas where the market fails, and that is where the state comes in. And this is what Thomas Piketty's argument is in his earlier book also, Capital in the 21st Century, where he talks about the fact that inequality is inherent in capitalism. And what must a state do? The state must intervene wherever the market does not do its job, which is why you find that the lowest inequality is in the Scandinavian countries, which are also definitely market economies, where the state intervenes to ensure that certain services and goods which are not provided by the market are provided by the state, and that is what we need to do. We need to ensure that, and for that the answer is not only with the state, but it's also with us, civil society. How many of us pay our taxes honestly? And that really brings us to the crux of the question. Governments must do their job, but civil society must also do its job. We've already heard the finance minister, Mr. Jaitley, talk about how few Indians really pay their taxes, how few Indians declare that they have income over 10 lakhs, over 1 crore. Until things change and civil society honors its part of the deal, I think it would be wrong to point a finger only to the government. But let me just conclude with one thing to answer Priyanka's question, that this study is only up to the year 2014. So until the period when the Congress government stepped aside and we had the BJP come in. And in the 70 years of independence so far, more than 60 plus years were under the Congress government. Inequalities have increased. So this is not a question of pointing a finger either at the Congress or at the BJP, but purely to say that when we shift to a market economy, it is true that inequalities will increase along with an increase in the rate of growth and rate of prosperity. And that is when the state must step in by providing opportunities and intervening only where the market fails.
I think the basic line of that entire argument is that growth cannot be cornered by a few. It has to percolate to the last man standing. And I think that's exactly what this panel believes in. But we're going to take a really quick breather here on the India development debate. But before we do that, we're actually going to get you a word from Thomas Piketty himself in conversation with Sandeep Gurumurthi.
India does not completely have the democratic, fiscal, educational institution that we need in order to put these powerful market forces into the common interest. I believe in market forces, in private property, but I think that we need these strong institutions, to make sure that all social groups benefit from these forces and from the growth process in a balanced manner. I should also add that in order to have sustained growth in the long run, you also need more equality. The idea that we should wait, that we develop more before we care about inequality and redistribution, I think is wrong, because I think after a certain point, you want more equality, more inclusive investment in education, in health, in order to have sustainable growth. Otherwise, some of the limits to growth that we see in India as compared to China, for instance, come from the fact that, in spite of the fact that China is, of course, much less democratic, somehow they were able to design a more inclusive strategy of investment in public infrastructure, education, health, so that the bottom half of the country in China, in a way, is better treated than in India, which is really sad, because this is what democracy is supposed to achieve. So it means that it doesn't work the way it should in India.
It's good to be back with you right here on the India development debate. The spotlight is on rising levels of inequality in India. I'm going to take it across to Mahesh Vyas. And, Mahesh Vyas, I must ask you, are we very often getting confused between inequality and poverty, and what is more important to get rid of? And is this misplaced priority the one reason why the entire socialism did guide our policy making all through the 1970s or the 80s actually?
I think getting into a debate of what happened in the 1970s would be futile at this point in time. There were different circumstances, the world was different, our conditions were different. What is important is to look at where we stand today, 25 years after we began the liberalization process. And what did we learn from this? And what we learned is that lower tax rates and a liberalized economy does lead to higher per capita income. That is very clear. I don't think there is any doubt in that. Has this been an iniquitous growth? The answer is yes. Piketty shows some very dramatic numbers. It is difficult to actually gulp those numbers. 1% having 22% of the income is really, really way out of any of the numbers that I could have thought of. So it looks like inequality has increased a lot more than what we could have anticipated. It is important for us to address this issue, and it is best for us to first recognize the need for us to look at inequality along with poverty. So far, we have in the past, in bits and pieces, in short bursts of enthusiasm, looked at measuring poverty. But I think a method of doing that was through setting up a committee. I think that's very old-fashioned. What we required is a continuous process of being able to measure poverty almost on an annual basis. I think that is possible. And equally possible is for us to measure inequality. Inequality is as bad as poverty. We are actually reasonably out of that poverty bracket, in the sense that we are tending to, from Tendulkar times, tending to redefine poverty, to include more people under poverty, saying that our aspirations have grown and therefore the measure of poverty should now change. I find that to be weird, but nevertheless it reflects one very important thing, that poverty as we understood earlier, abject poverty, which is lack of food and shelter, is gone. So what is more important today actually is inequality, and we need to measure inequality on a regular basis. What Thomas Piketty and company have done is a very complex exercise, which is based on data which is really extending themselves.
Right.
What we require is a more realistic, more complete way of measuring inequality.
Right, fair point. Jaggi, comment on that. Mahesh Vyas believes that inequality at this juncture is probably more important than poverty. And I'm quoting Arvind Panagriya here, the outgoing vice chairman of the Niti Aayog, who said that inequality is probably more relevant in rich and developed countries because if you were to go by the Gini coefficient that Maithili spoke about as well, then Kerala is probably the most unequal state and Bihar the most equal state in India.
Absolutely. I think if, you see, even when he is talking about 1922, where he said inequality was different, I think you are talking about a country that was bone poor, stone poor all over the place. There were very few rich people. That's why you had very low inequality. That was the time when the British were exploiting us. And between 70s and 80s, you saw a whole shift from private sector to public sector nationalization. Those things happened. It's only when growth happens that inequality grows. I think the problem with Piketty's thing, I'm not sure how exactly is measured it. I would worry less about the fact that the income, but the wealth inequality figures make no sense to me, because if you are counting stock market wealth as part of individual wealth, then it is completely wrong. Because if let's say Ambani owns his 50% or whatever it is he owns in Reliance is worth 22 billion, in what way can you call it private wealth when he is actually using that to control a company? I mean, it doesn't make sense to count stock market wealth in that kind of wealth. So I would suspect that the real wealth is far less. However, inequality must be tackled at the wealth end, which means intergenerational equity requires that you must have estate duty so that when people who create wealth can probably have a right to use it. But people who inherit the wealth should be paying more taxes before they start using that wealth. I think we need to have a strong tax on wealth generation, but income taxes, if you raise them too much, you will only get evasion. That is what you will get, and beyond 30-40%, I think you are not going to get compliance. People will just choose to hide their money. And that's exactly what you saw in the recent demonetization exercise. When you said you're going to tax them 50% plus 25% as deposits, how much money came in? Nothing.
Right.
So people chose to just deposit the money and keep quiet, because they said we'll rather take our chances with the law. I mean, when higher taxes, you will not get more money.
Okay, I'm going to take this question to Arvind Gupta, and I'm going to take the discussion away from what has happened up until 2014, because it's convenient to say it happened under the Congress. Let's talk about facts under the BJP. Why are we spending just 3.7% of the budget outlay on education? Why are we spending under 3% on healthcare? When will that change? Because for India to develop and for inequality to go away and for people to, the last mile to benefit from reforms and growth, we have to undo these statistics. These numbers have to be a lot higher. Why is it not going up? You've now presented 3 budgets.
Supriya, I will make a few comments here and I'll address the question that you have asked. I think one of the clear approaches, differences in approach, has been that, we want to widen the tax base, make our tax rates, both corporate, indirect taxes and personal income tax rates, very competitive with the region that we, in the similar region. So we have a clear path of where the corporate tax rate, for example, is going to go. Personal income tax is going to remain stable around the range it is. So the approach is to widen the tax network, not tax more. So that's been a clear philosophy of the finance minister in the last three to four budgets. The second point I want to make is, whatever collections we get, the approach of the government is to spend better, and that really answers your question. That this is no longer creative accounting that we have seen in the past. There is no acquisitions. This is really an approach to make sure that the allocated amounts are spent wisely and they go to the intended people. So the whole approach is shifted from just showing numbers and not really utilizing those numbers, but to actually utilize and make sure they go to the right people. And so, the plumbing has been fixed to make sure the money travels a lot faster a lot longer and lasts a longer. Much longer. So I think those are the
Arvind Gupta, I'm running out of time. You made your point. Arvind Gupta, I'm really running out of time. I need to get in a word from both Priyanka and Sunit Chopra. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. I just have 2 minutes left on the debate. Priyanka, to quickly, you wanted to come to the point that Arvind Gupta made on creative accounting. And my larger question, will the, let's not make it political, but today 11%. Priyanka, just one point. 11% of our of our budget is blocked in subsidies. How long are we going to, keep increasing our subsidy bill? The UPA did it for years. It's happening now as well. When are we going to invest in public health? In the point that Maithili made in education, when are we going to do that, Priyanka?
No, while with all due respect to Maithili and all due respect to Jaggi, I've been reading his columns and I'm a huge fan of his columns. I may disagree with what he writes at times, but all I'd like to say here is they are doing the easiest thing to do is accuse the previous government, accuse the society, accuse just about everyone, but not look at the challenges that this government has not been able to address, whether it is with demonetization or bringing in a clearer, transparent tax system with GST. We haven't seen that happen. They haven't addressed those. Though they're both economists, I highly respect. Having said that, you cannot go back to the Indira Gandhi era when we have post-liberalization. Our government has consciously tried to reduce the tax, tax burden on people, build a wider tax base that Arvind Gupta is talking about. This is something that we had been doing, and as far as GST is concerned, it was something that we had been trying to implement, was blocked for 10 odd years by the opposition that we had. So when we talk about a wider tax or tax income that we get, how we redistribute it is something that every government chooses to do. Now in this particular case, the government is not choosing to invest through welfare policies and through welfare schemes. They are only reducing it in every budget, every annual budget. This is something that I mentioned even at the beginning of the discussion, and I would want the government to address this particular problem, that when you talk about inequality, you also ensure that one way to reduce equality is to have more welfare schemes, invest more in welfare schemes, which we don't see this happening in this particular government, and not even a priority for this government.
Okay. Sunit Chopra, I'm going to let you have the last word on this, and just 30 seconds. I'm sure you and everyone in this panel agrees with me when I say that we need to make more investment in education, in healthcare. The big question is, where are we going to find the resources? So I'm asking you tonight, will you support the government's move to privatize Air India? Will you support the government moves to sell some of these assets and use those resources to invest in education, in healthcare? Will you support the government's move to sell Air India?
Getting money as plunder of public wealth. Why are you thinking of getting money as plunder of public wealth? You have to give more government and more governance.
But you need
what we have done is, we have not controlled the plundering of the rich who have taken the money outside, thousands of crores, and looted the country. On the other hand, we have demonetized the rural economy and destroyed their capacity to even exist. So the point is, we need more government and more governance. What this government has done is more government and less governance. And they have left
I get that point.
To the principle of the devil take the hindmost.
Okay, Mr. Sunit Chopra, I get your point, and I think that's a very, very left ideology that you're bringing to the table, but I don't think many on my panel at least agree with you on that. But we're completely out of time here. We'd like to thank each one of our panelists, Mahesh Vyas, R. Jagannathan, Maithili Busurnmat, Priyanka Chaturvedi, Arvind Gupta, and Mr. Sunit Chopra. Thanks very much for being with us and putting your views forward on the India development debate. We've put the lens on the inequality in India, and we do hope there's going to be an end to it.
Don't go anywhere. We're going to be back with Top 10 at 10 in just a few minutes from now. Keep it with ET Now. Good night.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/ETNow.